Welcome to the All Inclusive Podcast, a podcast that delves into the world of inclusion from accessibility all the way through to diversity.
So, Ollie, thank you very much for joining us. And as a way of introduction, could you just tell us about yourself?
Thanks for having me here, Ross. My name's Ollie. I work at Michael Page, and my role is twofold. How can we support businesses that we work with to be more inclusive? And then how can we support them to connect with and ultimately employ a more diverse, wide range of individuals?
So that probably leads us on to what the first question would be is, what is inclusive recruitment? And does it have a lot of different connotations depending on which companies you speak to?
Yeah, I think inclusive recruitment is it's an incredibly broad topic, and it's difficult to sum up in one line. I think ultimately it's the how can we make the whole recruitment process inclusive? So how can we connect with, how can we engage with, and ultimately hire a really diverse workforce by understanding and valuing the different traits that different people, or different traits and different experiences that people can bring to the table. And I think that's where you really unlock the real value of diversity of thought and inclusive workplaces and diverse teams.
Yeah, and this is music to my ears because obviously I think a lot of people listen to the podcast will already know that I'm dyslexic myself, and I wasn't diagnosed dyslexic until I was at university. In fact, I graduated from university and I was president of the student union, and I quickly realized that out of a group of 20 students that were forming the executive body, the ones that were dyslexic were super analytical and the ability to see things was phenomenal, but that isn't generally recorded by the education system, and they don't manage to capture that, because that person who has this like amazing abilities will not show as a GCSE, it'll not show it in an A level, it'll probably not even show in a degree, because most of them, like me, will underperform in exams. So exactly. You guys
say that again? Kind of interrupt and just say it would show, but it probably show negatively. Disadvantaged.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a thing. When it's a thing that triggered me to actually look at, could I be dyslexic? Was I went to university, I was the person that was showing people what to do just before the exams, and everybody was panicking. Yet the people I was showing that were clueless were outperforming me by 20% in the exams, right? And I'm like, how does this work? But it just warms my heart to see that if I, was to apply anywhere through somebody like yourselves, is that these qualities that I that I possess, that I don't think has ever realistically been measured by the education system, could come out in that process, and it could be, presented to an employer in such a way. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a lot of synergy in our stories, Ross. I'm also dyslexic. And I struggled through the school system and through university. And then actually what really led me into this line of work is I had an injury about 10 years ago, which left me with a disability. So I'm now a full-time wheelchair user.
All right.
And I suppose I have first-hand experience of the difficulties in how you feel like you're treated differently to the traditional hire, essentially, both from my experience of being dyslexic and now having a physical disability as well. And very similar to you, I think there are an incredible array of traits that we as diverse individuals can bring to a workforce. You spoke about your experience of being dyslexic and thinking outside the box, and then there's my story of having a physical disability, and I live in a world that isn't adapted for me, right? So I'm constantly coming up against challenges. I'm constantly having to problem solve. I have a whole array of other things that come along with my disability, which means I need to be incredibly resourceful, but I also need to be able to plan ahead and time manage. So there's there's so many things that I have developed because of my diverse background
That'll
that
make you a
aren't
much better employee for somebody.
exactly that aren't seen through education. They're not seen by the kind of awards that you get on exams, but they're the exact traits that businesses are looking for. They're looking for people to be able to think outside the box. They're looking for people to be able to come up with solutions and problems and think differently to the norm, and be able to better connect with the customers that we're serving as businesses. And I think we do that by having diverse workforces, you know, that replicate the society that we live in.
Absolutely. Can I ask, how old were you when you were actually diagnosed with dyslexia?
So I was diagnosed with dyslexia just before university.
All right.
So it was actually in the year of my A levels, but I was having a bit of additional support before then, because they'd highlighted that I may have dyslexia before then, because we're struggling with fitting the normal educational box requirements. So we're struggling to kind of fit that classic norm that they were looking for, of writing essays and things like that. But
I mean, the education system, it's largely based on, you know, memory, like being told something, accepting it, and then regurgitating it in a controlled manner, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, you touched on it before when you said a person who thinks differently. Now, the education system in itself is not teaching you to think differently, it's teaching you to think how everybody else does, and that's how you do well in exams. Now, every company that has been successful in its life thinks, and more importantly, operates and executes differently. You know, you got the classics like Google. You know, they stormed onto the scene by doing search just different enough to give it better results. You know, Apple, they pivoted everything, but the main thing that was behind it was like they thought differently. And you know, you're an organization that is looking for people that can think differently. That isn't measured by the education system, and I just think it's phenomenal. I think there's a lot of personal into me, because I think if I didn't start off the business, because I went straight from university and started a business off, I was like, I don't know what job I would do, and I don't know anybody that would actually employ me back in the day. So
yeah, and I think that's that in itself is quite interesting, right? Because if I think back to when I had my injury and I sustained my disability, I didn't realize I had a preconception against people with a disability until I was lying in that hospital bed with a disability myself. And all of a sudden, my horizons went from, you know, I can do absolutely anything, to massively reducing. And I was incredibly lucky to have support structure around me, to be able to kind of open up those opportunities again and change the way that I viewed myself. And I think that's because very often we don't see people being included. So actually, the more that we can integrate inclusive processes into everything, actually, it then builds the confidence in all of those people. So people do have the confidence to put themselves out there. And yes, you've obviously been incredibly successful. You've set up this business, but let's say if that wasn't an option, you would have, by seeing more inclusive processes and systems out there to be able to help people, you then realize that actually you're not a burden, and actually people are wanting to be able to utilize all of the incredible skills that you can bring because of the way you think, right? That may have been a negative within the education system. So I think the more we can get inclusive processes out there, the better it's going to be all around about changing those preconceptions and removing the negativity that is often associated to it.
And would you say because of your own experience, you realized that you were biased, but unconsciously, and I don't like to use those terms because unconscious bias is used in so many different ways these days, but do you see it as that forms part of your mission of life, I suppose, that you realize that you were biased in such a way, and you were like, actually, if everybody doesn't see people with disabilities in this biased way, you know, it could be a better planet for all of us. That sounds very grandiose, doesn't it? But it is true.
It is true. It is true. And I think that is, that hits the nail on the head. And I think, well, this is a massive conversation. I think it's really, it's a huge challenge, and not something we can obviously solve by just chatting about it now. But it's it's tough, right? And it's how do we I'm just trying to think about how to phrase it with the biases. It's it is like, and it's something that's taken time for me to reflect on, because at that time I didn't realize I had those biases, right? And I think it's something that was ingrained in me, and something that I really didn't realize before that point. And obviously during that period where I was having to kind of acknowledge the constraints that I had put on myself because of those preconceived biases, that's something very, very, it's very challenging. And how do we, and I think it goes back to that larger conversation about having more organizations that are overt about creating inclusive processes. Because I think when you don't see that, it reinforces the difference that individuals suddenly feel. So then they self-deselect themselves from processes. So I think you can you can have inclusive processes, like as many as inclusive processes as you want, but if you're not actually being proactive and reaching out to those individuals, you're not going to have the diverse workforce that actually comes through those inclusive processes.
100%. And some people often said to me, like, what is the end goal? Because I did do that sort of grandiose, it's a better planet. What is the end goal for anybody who's working, kind of in inclusivity and disability awareness and the likes of that? And I says, well, the end goal ultimately, I don't think you ever reach the end goal, but if there was one, it's where disability isn't a disability. The reason it's a disability is because society hasn't adjusted for people that doesn't fit within this 60%. That is the majority, and then you've got neurodiverse, where you've got kind of Asperger's, autism on one side, then the other side is dyslexia. Then you have, people with physical disabilities. Things wouldn't be a disability if everything was catered for them, because in a world where everybody, for example, would be in a wheelchair, that wouldn't be a disability, because the world would just adapt to it. And it's making everybody so aware of it's not different, it's not less, it's just another way,
Yeah, definitely, it is another way. And I think it's also it's definitely not less. I'm obviously biased, but I would argue that it's more, because if we have everyone in the room thinking the same way, then actually, like you say, we're not going to have that innovation. We're not going to be able to create new solutions. And I think by having that diversity of thought within the room, to be able to challenge each other and be able to innovate, I think is incredibly exciting. There's a reason why GCHQ is one of the most neurodiverse organizations out there, because they know the strength of thinking differently.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I always remember back in the day when it was me doing the sales for the company, and that was a bad time, because I'm not naturally, well, I can sell, but I'm not a salesperson, if that makes sense. And we've done a presentation for a guy who used to work for Apple, and this was old Apple when Steve Jobs was there in the first incarnation, and they were such a forward-thinking company. When they done focus groups, they used to try and test to find out somebody who was dyslexic and actually exclude them, but exclude them for not the reason you're thinking of, is because they felt they were that insightful and aware and switched on. They'd be able to see through the process that they're trying to do, and they probably wouldn't get an unbiased person on the group, because they'd know why Apple is doing something, and they'd figure it out first. And that just kind of blew my mind. It's like, in the 90s, and a company like Apple was realizing then, the qualities of people who have a diverse condition, It's just it is absolutely, it was beautiful, to be fair, to hear. And I wish that happened to me when I was a child, because I just thought I was thick. So,
yeah, exactly.
But I
exactly.
touched on your point, what you said earlier about, I built up successful companies now. I think I've got a fantastic team here, and it's not me. It's all of us together. But I think a large part of that is the fact that I maintained confidence at school because I was very good at sport. But the education in itself, because the disability was something that kind of almost eroded me confidence. And that is one of the bigger things for people with all disabilities is, and I'm kind of almost sensing here the way you talked about, particularly when you had the accident, it's almost, you might have had like a crisis of confidence at that point of like your place in the world, how does it fit in, and the likes of that. And I think that is a large part of the mission. It's not just the adjustment, it's about the person and the confidence of the person in their own life and their own ability with whatever sort of condition that they may have.
Yeah, I think changing those perspectives, the individual's perspectives, is incredibly important. And if I think, well, anyone in life has role models, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure when you were younger, I don't know what sport you played, but I'm sure you wanted to. What sport did you play, Ross?
100-meter sprint, and it was Linford Christie. And
Nice,
I was actually I was the fastest in the Northeast for quite a few years, and I was nationally ranked. I was on, remember Grandstand back in the day?
I don't know if I do remember Grandstand.
It used to be on BBC, and it used to be 4 hours of sport, and it had everything on.
Oh yes, yeah, okay, yeah, I do remember Grandstand. Yeah,
I was on there racing. It was
brilliant.
Scenic game.
So you wanted to be Linford Christie growing up, right? And I think that's you most likely have different role models now. I don't know if you're still trying to do the 100 meters that often, but I think that's something.
I'm 42 and I'm carrying a bit more weight than what I was 20 years ago. Put it that way.
Well, you can still be hoping. You can still be hoping.
Yeah.
Who knows? But I think that's really interesting when you look at people with a disability, because how many people did you know growing up who were adults and were successful and had dyslexia? Because if I look back at myself when I was injured, I didn't know anyone outside of Paralympians that I saw on the TV, or maybe a James Bond villain who had a disability and was out there in life. And I think that's something that really constrains people. And I think that probably wraps into what I was saying earlier around having more visibility around processes, and it opens up those opportunities and the scope that people believe they have when they do have a challenge within life.
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I was just thinking there, did I have any, the first person I can think of that was kind of very like, I'm dyslexic, was Richard Branson.
Yeah.
And he probably is a hero of mine now, because he constantly is pushing particularly the dyslexic agenda, while its qualities of how it's a good thing. And I do think he is changing a lot of people's perceptions of it, because if I think back, I thought I was dyslexic at school, actually, and I did say to the teacher, I think I'm dyslexic, and she said, don't be stupid, Ross. But then they give my paper to a special needs teacher, and they just read it and said, look, he's not dyslexic, he's just thinking ahead of his writing. Obviously they were wrong, but I thought at that age, I pretty much know I'm dyslexic, and I'm managing to get around the system and hide it. But it was that urge that I wanted to hide it for some reason, and I thought it was a good thing, and I was winning by getting through and getting to university, but I was sure I was dyslexic.
Because it's seen as a negative. And even at a young age, it was for some reason within you that you knew it was a negative. And I think the more people that we have, like Richard Branson, that promote the conversation around the power that comes from that diversity of thought and people from different backgrounds, and like the more opportunities we're going to have for everyone else coming in after those people that are championing the conversation. And I think we need to open up more avenues for people to be able to get into those opportunities in the first place, right? And that's all about having inclusive processes and helping to build their confidence to go for those opportunities and put themselves out there and feeling included within it all.
So that probably leads us nicely on to, Michael Page. It has an inclusive recruitment process. How did it get to where it is today? And it's fantastic to say also it has a global footprint. So, you've got somebody who's got inclusive processes and inclusive recruitment that touches so many different countries.
Yeah, definitely. I think, if I look back at Page, I've been at Michael Page for about a year, but their journey around this whole conversation started 10, 15 years ago, at least. And I suppose that's really important to paint the picture around, because a lot of organizations, when they look at creating an inclusive and diverse workforce, they just try and bring diversity in through the front door and they don't do anything else. Yeah. But actually, it's far more important to create an inclusive culture, because you'll most likely already have some people from different diverse backgrounds within your organization, but you need to help the workforce understand the real value that comes from diversity and that inclusive culture. Otherwise, you are going to have these incredible individuals that you're going to bring into your organization, and they'll leave because they won't feel like they have those equal opportunities. So where did Michael Page's journey start in this whole conversation? It started 10, 15 years ago when we started to look and challenge our own processes around what we do internally and how do we support our staff? How do we support working mums, for example? How do we support people that maybe are having health challenges at work? How do we support people with mental health? And what do we do to support our colleagues that are disabled? And I suppose that goes across all different diversity characteristics. What do we do to support those individuals to help them feel empowered? And also, how do we help them feel like it is safe to speak? That is incredibly important. And how do we create those feedback loops? And I think that's what we're constantly working on. I don't think anyone ever gets to the end point. I think this conversation is constantly developing and changing, and we need to constantly be challenging ourselves to be doing better. And I think that's what's really led us to being at the position we are today, is going through that long journey of not always getting it right, but wanting to continuously move in the right direction and learn from any of the challenges that we have had in the past.
Yeah, and it's interesting. What I'll pick up on a point that you said. It's okay to speak about it, and I just reflected in there in my head of I can't remember the exact statistics, but it was quite scary, of somebody who put dyslexia on their CV, how often it was rejected outright just because they put that word on. And I think it was something crazy, like 70% of the CVs are rejected just because they put the word dyslexic on. And that in that case, without an inclusive recruitment process like you've got, it's not safe to speak, and it's not safe employment-wise in those scenarios to be yourself and to be open about who you are and what disability you have.
Exactly. And I think it's also, how do we can work as much as we can internally to create those safe spaces, but also what can we do externally to build that level of trust with potential future Page employees that we don't even know or we haven't spoken to yet. And that's by being really proactive with this conversation and being willing to put ourselves out there and draw a line in the sand and say, look, we are working and we are trying to improve in this area. We are investing in supporting different diverse groups, and we're actively opening up to proactively opening up to as many different diverse groups as possible, because we genuinely know the value that comes with having an incredibly diverse workforce. And I think the more we can promote that conversation externally, that's actually going to really promote that inclusive recruitment pipeline, because hopefully that's going to create that level of safety for those candidates in that pipeline. So then they're more willing to talk about reasonable adjustments with us if that is something that they do need, because we need to make sure as a business we're giving everyone the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities, and sometimes that doesn't fit the traditional interview process. You know, sometimes we have to change the process to allow them to demonstrate their capabilities and how they work in the business.
And would you say there's any sort of standard mistakes a lot of recruitment companies make with regards to inclusive recruitment? Is there mistakes that you see other people do that seems to be repeated time and time again?
It's a big question, Morris. It's a big question.
I think, you know, I just realized after I finished that question, I was like, you know what, that question is probably a whole podcast in itself.
Yeah. It's a bit of a rabbit warren, right? I think we've got, I suppose if you break it down into 3 areas, okay? So in the classic recruitment, you've got how are we actually attracting people? And recruitment companies need to be more proactive and be willing to have these challenging conversations and go out there and try and champion this conversation, because that creates those safe spaces and confidence within these groups of people to have the confidence to go and work and want to talk to these conversations. So how can recruitment businesses be more proactive in the overt outreach? How can recruitment businesses make it easier for people to apply? I'm sure, well, you said you didn't, you set up your business straight away, Ross. But yeah. If I think back to myself, I used to cringe when getting asked to write a cover letter, for example, because that just it's not a way to demonstrate my capability. And there's processes that can be changed within that application process, and that may be removing those barriers like cover letters. It may even be making an inclusive website, right? The majority of recruitment websites out there aren't inclusive, which is something that blows my mind a little bit. And I think that's a massive piece. So how can we allow more people to apply for the job?
Have an inclusive website where people put the CVs in, right? I mean, I can fire a statistic at you there. 83% of people who go to a website who have a diverse need and that need isn't met will go to another website that does have it.
Yeah.
So this was a study that was, it's called the Clickaway Pound, and it was actually initialized by National Car Rental UK, and it found the displaced spending on websites alone was, I wish I had the statistics said, it was around 14 to 16 billion. Such a simple thing, right? It's a business sense, and some people still don't do it. Find it bizarre. So,
and I don't think the recruitment industry is the only one that's guilty in this area, right? So many organizations need to get better at that first touch point with your customer or potential candidate. How can you become more inclusive in that first touch point? Because what you're saying is so true. And then I think, so if that's just the attraction piece of recruitment, I think, and then if we go on to the engagement piece, so how are we engaging with candidates? I think we need to be willing to ask questions more. What can we do to support the candidates, and ask those questions around reasonable adjustments and build that trust and that safe space. And that's going to take a lot of time, but that's incredibly important to be able to support those candidates through the process. And then ultimately, then obviously you get to the jumping a few stages, but that selection phase, we've got to do more as businesses and the industry as a whole. And I argue actually every business has to do more of this, is how can we go back to the basics and start breaking down those biases more? How can we help our colleagues to really see the value in having that diverse workforce, and and understanding that maybe they're not going to look or behave like a previous hire, and they're going to bring a hell of a lot of value to your team, but you may have to go about it slightly differently. And I think often people can be scared by what they don't know. So how can we empower those hiring managers to make the right decisions for their business and get better diversity of thought?
It was one of the developments, because you're always learning, right? And starting Recite has been a journey for myself of almost like understanding why I've acted this way all my life is down to the fact that I've got a diverse condition, being dyslexia, but I'm still learning. And we now have 2 people in our organization that has Asperger's. And the first person who's quite senior, it was a challenge for me to manage them, because you have essentially got to manage in a different way, and you've got to be aware of that. But once I got used to managing this person in a different way to a kind of neurotypical person, I'm very consciously now realizing that there's a lot of jobs that we have within our business, because we're getting to a decent size now. We've got about 75 staff between the 2 companies, that I should be actively looking for somebody with Asperger's, because I think they will perform certain functions a lot better than somebody who would be typically neurotypical. And it's the polar opposite of dyslexia. Like, everything that I am absolutely useless at, this employee is absolutely phenomenally, scaringly good at. So even now, in the last year, I've realized, I'm still biased to a certain extent, and I didn't, we should be actively looking for dyslexic people for certain functions within the business positions. We should be looking for, realistically, some people that have Asperger's that should play to the strengths. So every day is a school day. That's how I would run that off.
Yeah, and I think actually as well, it all comes down to the individual at the end of the day, because I think people have a whole diversity of different strengths within different characteristics as well, right? Because no 2 people who are dyslexic are the same, and I think there's that. It's just getting to know the individual, and I think you touched on a really nice point, that maybe you had to adjust your management style slightly, and I think processes and management styles, for example, they may have to be shifted and they may have to be adjusted. But I bet there's actually things that you've taken away from that adjustment that you've brought into other processes to improve them. And one of my favorite phrases is, small changes necessary for some are beneficial to all. Because that's so powerful, right? Because by being more inclusive and making those small changes, it's actually going to improve the playing field for everyone.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'll give you an example. And this is so kind of, this is a classic dyslexic story, so it'll go off in many tangents, and I hope it's concise enough to leave in the podcast, put it that way. But we are all strangely biased in a way that we don't understand, because we just accept normal as normal. And the way I would deal with a person who's got Asperger's is we have to be a lot more direct and a lot more prescriptive on what I'm asking them to do. And even though that's exactly what I want them to do, and if I was speaking to somebody who was just a neurotypical, if I said it in a straight way, that's exactly what I want them to do. But somebody who's neurotypical would take it as an offense, right? Because it's too direct. Even though I'm not saying anything derogatory, I'm not saying anything aggressively, I'm not being too firm, I'm just being too direct for a person who's neurotypical. And it does make you start to question, is why can't I just be that direct with your average person? Because they think, are you being okay with me? Because you've just, and often you've got to do a lot of fluff and sort of like, is it okay if you do this? And that would be absolutely fantastic, and all this sort of fluff to make sure that the person, right? But when I started really thinking about it, and I've got to admit, it was probably having a couple of glasses of wine. Think about the concept of tidying your house, right? It's not about putting things away. It's normally about putting things at right angles. In the dyslexic, one of the traits of the dyslexic is one of the signs is they are normally a messy person. because they can see the order in the mess, and they don't need to have things at right angles. So often when you come into a house to clean your house up for a neurotypical person, so your average person who just likes a relatively clean house, you come in to put everything at right angles to each other. It's in a form, and it's the papers are stacked on high. And when you explain it like that, that sounds so strange. Like, yeah, is there any chance you could come and give us a hand to put everything at right angles in my kitchen, please, because it's a bit of a mess? And then we realize we're all on the scale to a certain extent, you know. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm thinking, do I like right angles? That's the question I'm asking myself. Yeah, I do.
The cleaning, you know, you stack things on.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
put something right next to it. And it just got me thinking, so, you know, the whole world, realistically, even the people who would say it falls in the neurotypical camp, is neurodiverse in its own strange ways.
Yeah, I think, you know, everyone, and that comes back to that inclusive culture, really, really neatly, kind of round robin, because by creating inclusive recruitment processes, we're allowing everyone, no matter who you are, to be able to demonstrate your skill set to the best of your ability for that team. And I think that's what's incredibly important. It's about giving everyone the opportunity to be able to demonstrate their skill set, no matter who you are.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'd like to almost wrap up with a big thank you to yourself and almost to your industry. And I'll give you the background is that I started the company in 2010. And in those days, diversity was on people's agenda, but it was often seen as something that they should do because they know they have to do, and they want to be seen to do it. So it got a lot of praise. Everybody was interested in what we did. Everybody saw it, but a lot of people weren't keen on being the first to do it because nobody else did it. And if nobody else is doing it, it doesn't look like you're doing anything bad by not having an inclusive website. But there was one area that was way ahead of everywhere else, and that was recruitment. But not just recruitment companies like yourself, but the whole industry of recruitment departments within majors were the people that often understood the need for this. And we have created so much awareness and got so many large clients like Tesco. There's a few others to mention, but I've got to make sure that it is how it was through the recruitment web team that we first got in, is that it allowed us to kind of open so many doors. And I think I will be ever thankful to that area of industry, because I think that it allowed inclusive websites to move forward maybe 5 or 6 years faster than what it would have, because there was one sector that was often integrated into many large companies that understood. So it's almost like a thank you.
I'll take it on behalf of the industry. I'll take it on behalf of the industry. But I think, you know, that it's really great to hear, and I think it comes down to the fact that ultimately we as an industry speak to a lot of people, right? So we understand and see those needs that are out there. So I'm glad that you feel that as an industry we've been forward thinking in this conversation.
And to end off, what do you think holds for the future of Michael Page with regards to inclusive recruitment? That's another one of those big questions, Ollie.
I'd like it to just be called recruitment. To be completely honest, I would like it to become a norm. So it's just recruitment, and actually there isn't a specific word you have to put in front of it saying this is going to be an inclusive process. Actually, it is just the process that everyone follows, and I think that's how it is truly inclusive.
And that completely aligns with our goals. As you know, it's not a disability, it's just another way of doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's a great way to end off. Ollie, I'd like to, it's very, very, very insightful, and I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. Great to speak to you today, Ross.